So now the United States, under the Trump administration, is beginning to ramp up the media war and potentially the ground war against Venezuela. Um, we have to understand the situation in Venezuela in the context of the history of the United States, going back to the Monroe Doctrine, President Monroe, basically stating that all of the Americas are in the sphere of influence of the United States, um, and that they should be regulated by the US. So governments that have found themselves, for instance, against US business interests, like Allende, the democratically elected moderate socialist in Chile, have found themselves on the wrong end of the American governing elites' agenda. And as we know, with General Pinochet, backed by the United States in Chile on September 11th, 1973, overthrew the democratically elected president, and enacted great violence afterwards, rounding people up in stadiums, placing people in concentration camps in the desert, killing those said people in the stadiums, having bodies thrown out over the Pacific Ocean in helicopters so that there would be no remnants, remains, mass disappearances of dissidents, of this right-wing general that was backed by the United States. And the reason for that was because the United States had an agenda of privatizing and looting the resources of Chile. What's happening in Venezuela in terms of the recognition of Juan Guaido as the president versus Nicolas Maduro, and one may have plenty of criticisms of Maduro. However, the United States has no right to incite a civil war, much less create the conditions for an invasion. And we have to look at who's behind this. The Trump administration, of course, but within the Trump cabal is John Bolton, who is this kind of Dr. Strangelove, walrus-looking Henry Kissinger figure, who is desperate to get his friends' hands on Venezuelan oil. Now, Venezuela's oil reserves they match Saudi Arabia, and so one of the acts that Guaido has done in the National Assembly is to begin the privatization of oil of the state oil company. So the United States is hedging its bets on using Venezuela as its next resource extraction project in Latin America. And, of course, the U.S. is incredibly fortunate in the sense that the largest and most powerful country in Latin America, Brazil, is now being run by a neo-fascist plutocrat supporting President Jair Bolsonaro, who is 100% behind the coup. So we have a situation that is incredibly dangerous and that could spiral out of control at any moment. The situation in Venezuela is already terrible, in part because of U.S. sanctions. What I always find remarkable about U.S. hypocrisy is that politicians in Washington will scream about how terrible the human rights and humanitarian situation is in the country, and then freeze all of its assets and take its money. Recently, $7 billion of Venezuelan assets were frozen in the United States. And now the sanctions are happening on oil exports. Similar situation in Iran, where the goal is a regime change, has nothing to do with human rights. Now, you may say, well, all right, Maduro is a terrible person. What would be wrong with getting rid of him, right? This is one of the, I suppose, interventionist objections. Well, first of all, it's hypocritical and double standard. The United States, I'm a U.S. citizen, U.S. Italian, dual national. Fortunately, Italy is calling for negotiations along with Mexico and Uruguay, and other nations as well, Cuba and Russia and China. Uh, if the United States was so concerned about human rights, then why on earth is Donald Trump writing love letters with the dictator of North Korea, where people are literally born into penal colonies because of what their parents may have said at some point, allegedly or not? Why are we aligned? Why is the United States aligned with Saudi Arabia, whose national symbol is now basically the bone saw? Okay, and on top of that, the U.S. has unwavering military, economic, financial support for Israel, which continues to illegally occupy the West Bank and Gaza, shoot and kill unarmed Palestinian demonstrators, and continue to build settlements in the occupied West Bank, and oftentimes using violent force through its ultra nationalist Zionist settlers, kind of paramilitary, to terrorize Palestinians out of their homes, in order to ethnically cleanse the region of Palestinians to open it up for Jewish only settlements. So if the United States was so concerned about human rights, it would, basically tell its client state, Israel, to stop doing these things and to negotiate at least a two-state solution by withdrawing to the 1967 border lines. And it would also put pressure on Saudi Arabia to stop locking up women for trying to drive, and stoning, killing people who are members of the LGBT community, etc., and also maybe put pressure on North Korea as well, instead of this, quote, embrace that Trump has with its leader. And so the United States has a long history of hypocritical imperialist policies. Now, this is a part of a larger plan, obviously, to enrich the top 1% in the United States and the corporations that they own and control. And so this is nothing more than a money and power grab. John Bolton himself has openly said that this is, one of the benefits of this would be the oil companies. The oil companies will be able to come in, and I think he used the term, create, good investments opportunity in Venezuela. And so the situation in Venezuela is very, very tenuous. And as Americans, or as people in the global stage, we need to make sure that we are putting pressure now to stop any sort of U.S. military intervention in Venezuela. That's got to be the top priority, because U.S. military intervention in other countries has led to awful consequences. I'm not going to talk about every single one of them, but I will say that in terms of U.S. military intervention, look at Libya, look at what we did there. It's a terrible nightmare, and this happened under the Obama administration. And the situation in Libya is horrendous. because of US military intervention. On top of that, one can look at the fact that we supported a coup in Venezuela in 2009 and continued to support the illegitimate leader, in Honduras in 2009, and continued to support the illegitimate leader of that country despite widespread protests. And now a lot of people are fleeing that country because of the terror that the United States has caused, only to be treated like garbage